Thanks a lot for joining us today. And we get to talk to two experts who've been researching about rubber for a while in the lower Mekong region for a while. So my first question to you, Juliet. So you've been researching about rubber quite a bit in Lao, and also the investments that have come in from China. Can you tell us a little bit about what has been the history of rubber and its investments into Lao?
Rubber is one of multiple boom crops that have kind of swept across all of mainland Southeast Asia, you could say. The whole Mekong region has seen a lot of crop booms, especially since the early 2000s. It really started expanding in the 2000s, but the conditions enabling the rubber boom, I think, were laid in the prior decade. So in the 90s, you saw tons of new land laws around the region. A couple other foreign donors really were pouring money into land titling. The National Forest Allocation Policy, a couple of different policies, basically delineated village boundaries from forest areas and put forest under the authority of the Lao state. And so in the 2000s, when developing countries, including Laos, started seeking foreign investment into land as a way of kind of jumpstarting their agricultural sector development. That whole land titling decade really made it very fast for foreign investors to come in, get land concessions, and be able to invest in crops. And so rubber was the top crop invested in for a good chunk of that time of rapid agricultural expansion in Laos. This was kind of paired with factors like the global price of rubber. It skyrocketed through the 2000s. It was basically a bubble in the rubber price globally. And it was also that Laos's neighbors, China and Vietnam, had big rubber estates, big rubber state companies that had run out of and exhausted their access to cheap land and were looking to expand. It was really lucrative because of the high prices, and it grows in uplands where high levels of poverty in Laos are particularly concentrated. And so rubber started to be seen, especially in northern Laos, as kind of a silver bullet for development in the uplands of the country. And one more piece of that was, opium eradication campaigns had been run a lot in northern Laos. Most rubber in Laos was rapidly kind of established between 2006 and 2011. But the earliest people that established rubber in Laos were smallholders right on the Chinese border. Yeah, there's these multiple explanations as to how rubber boomed in Laos between 2006 and the early 2010s.
Keyword for us being the UN Red program specifically, we have this project going on right now for the UN Red program in the Lower Mekong. The UN Red being an initiative to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. So keyword there for us is deforestation. Can you tell us a little bit about rubber and its impact on natural forests?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to kind of think through deforestation through a specific crop. Think of it as a line of dominoes, to think even past, the larger faith that we put in monoculture, the push that we have for commercial export-oriented cash crops. These kind of things have all led to this rubber boom and the fact that rubber is deforesting. So definitely rubber has been a huge driver of deforestation. So we have to also think about how rubber intersects with forest cover, right? So a lot of the remaining forest cover was in the uplands, these places that were harder to tap into for timber extraction, et cetera. So you had good forests in the uplands, and rubber is one of the few crops, one of the few big cash crops, high earning crops that grow well on sloping land at higher elevations. And so rubber was not only extremely lucrative in terms of calculations based on prices in the 2000s, there are always all these other pressures. It also happened to be a crop that fits in the places where remaining forests were, because oil palm, another crop that we really think of as driving deforestation, oil palm has moved into those traditional rubber producing areas and pushed rubber north. So definitely rubber has been, people attribute it as one of the top drivers of deforestation in the mainland Mekong, the mainland Southeast Asian region. But a lot of it is I think of it in terms of this like long domino effect line of factors.
That's really interesting. Other deforestation crops also even more adding to the pressure of deforestation by rubber in Laos and in the region. I'm going to turn over to Hillary. So how do you see the current landscape of rubber?
I think one of the interesting things about rubber was that, not only was it a crop that was promoted for foreign investment in Laos, and so you saw it coming in as, a crop favoured by international companies through concessions on land granted to them by the state, but it was also attractive to and promoted to rural households as a form of sedentary agriculture. So you saw a large take up of production in households, and there's actually kind of a perverse sort of policy circle there to a certain extent, with the government promoting sedentary agriculture instead of shifting cultivation. And rubber was one of the early crops that they promoted. So smallholders took it up partly through the forest land allocation process, but also in Northern Laos, in particular, the opium replacement policy. The reason that the government promoted that was because they saw those households as driving deforestation through their shifting cultivation. There's currently around 280,000 hectares of rubber planted in Laos, and about 250,000 of those hectares went in between 2006 and 2014. So the bulk of it went in there. There was a bit that came in before and a bit that's come in afterwards, but really the core of that went in that kind of 10-year period. And that's sustaining latex production now. So I think it's around 90% of the crop now is actually producing latex. So it's really in its prime from that point of view. At the moment, about 53% of the area of rubber in Laos is either smallholder owned and managed, or is under contract farming. So it's a partnership between farmers and companies, and the rest of it is under concessions on state lands. And farmers often, sometimes intercrop with their rubber at the very early stages so that they can get another crop until the rubber grows up enough to produce latex that can be tapped at a sustainable or a constant supply. And when they start tapping, 2 to 3 tonnes per hectare per year is a reasonable yield, but it produces a really good income for households that tap it, as well as the companies that tap it, and farmers who tap rubber, really see a good income from rubber. The ownership of rubber is much more diverse and mixed in the north. You see concessions, you see smallholders, and you see contract farmers all together. In the south, it seems to be much more dominated by concessions. And there's also a split there in the sense that you see the Chinese investors operating in the north and the Vietnamese investors operating in the south, and that's obviously to do with proximity to the markets. And then in the middle, there's a bit of Thai investment as well. So, for example, in the Luang Prabang, where you guys will be having a look, there's a really strong mix there of small concessions, contract farming, and smallholder grown rubber. So it's a really nice mix of investment types in that area for you to look at.
Thanks, Hilary. So yeah, a little bit of geopolitics also coming in, as I heard you talking about more smallholders, more diverse mix of things happening in the north with the Chinese investments, whereas in the south, a lot more concessions. So bigger areas being allocated to companies and especially investors from Vietnam. And you also mentioned, Hilary, about the age of these rubber trees, when they were planted, their subsequent age, and how they contribute to whether it's latex, whether they're under tapping, and at what stages they're under tapping. So I think it's important for us to understand a bit about the supply chain. What is the rubber supply chain? Juliet, can you tell us a little bit about what is the rubber supply chain in general? How does that work?
So a little bit of rubber is going into a ton of different products that we use every day, and then a ton of products that are really important. But yeah, 71% of natural rubber today is consumed by the global tire industry. China is the top consumer, and Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia are the top producers. So China consumes far more than India, US, Thailand are kind of far behind China. And then over 90% of natural rubber globally is produced by those three countries: Indonesia, Malaysia and Thailand. So when we think about what is between the tree and the tire, you have rubber trees, which are 99% of the trees that the world taps for rubber latex are Hevea brasiliensis. But so you take a rubber tree, you kind of insert a small tapped line in it, and then latex, which is this kind of milky liquid, which you guys will see on your trip. The latex is collected in cups and then kind of coagulated. There's chemicals that coagulate, or you can let them kind of sit out and coagulate on their own. And then the cups of latex are kind of combined, brought to a factory, washed, shredded, and they're basically they're heated up to kind of stick together and then hung out to dry. So in the case of Laos, most rubber is being sent to either to China through the border with Yunnan in the north of Laos, or it's being sent into Vietnam to be kind of processed, and then Vietnam sells most of its rubber. It does kind of produce some, but it's going through usually those two countries. Some is going out to Thailand.
It takes about 5 to 7 years for tapping to start. And most rubber trees, can be tapped for around 25 years. And then the latex starts to decline. So once the trees mature, they've been tapped for a long time, the supply drops off, and it doesn't become so economical to maintain the tree for the latex production. And depending on how the crop's been managed, and the management does affect the wood, people can then harvest the trees. And rubber wood is an extremely important and increasingly important wood crop in Southeast Asia. So previously Malaysia was the biggest supplier of rubber logs, and I think now Thailand has just taken over Malaysia as the biggest global producer of rubber logs, most of which again is going into China, but also into other countries. And it's used for solid wood products. So a lot of furniture is now made out of rubber wood because it's light, it's easy to use. But the problem with it is that it needs to be treated before it's manufactured into product. So rubber wood deteriorates very quickly because of the high latex content in the wood. And there's only primary processing in Laos. So the kind of value addition to the crop is relatively limited in that sense, in that it gets, smoked and then directly exported, and then the other countries actually turned it into the products that most people use. While there's big rubber wood sectors in China and Vietnam and Thailand, it wasn't until 2021 that the first rubber wood processing facility opened up in Laos, and that's in Luang Nam Ta, which has some of the oldest rubber trees. And that small wood processing factory, it's really only very small at the moment, is peeling rubber logs and shipping the veneer from that peeling process back into China, where it's been manufactured into plywood, and then it's being re-imported back into Laos. So until that factory ramps up in scale, there's going to be an export re-import, but it's certainly a really good opportunity for rubber growers in the future in Laos to sell their wood.
So what I'm hearing, Hillary, is that we talked about the history of rubber in Laos, and it seemed like it was a really long time crop that's been here. But actually the processing, especially on the rubber log side, rubber wood side, is actually just coming in. You said 2021 was the first processing plant in Luang Nam Ta. Yep. So it takes a while first for that latex industry to come in. Most of it is exported, or all of it is eventually exported. And then now is finally when we're seeing possibly a start of an eventual wood industry. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And the challenge is going to be how sustainable is that wood industry, and how will the rubber crop compete with other crops that particularly farmers might choose to plant as an alternative to rubber in the future.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So there is, you mentioned sustainability. There's sustainability in terms of how does it sustain a livelihood? How does it sustain in terms of an industry, the volume that you need? We also have sustainability, another keyword that we're focused on in our program, UNRED program, in terms of how sustainable is that production line, the whole supply chain. So question to you, Juliet, sustainability in the rubber industry itself. How is the world responding to sustainability as a demand from the consumers?
There's been a big response and a serious response, partly because of these numbers in terms of deforestation. And as Hillary was mentioning, there are a number of spots along the supply chain that considerable concerns about pollution, environmental impacts of other sorts are key. But the most high profile point of pressure that's been used so far is really the deforestation question. And what you saw was a lot of intense public pressure. And that's come along with an influx of funding into deforestation related efforts since the 2000s. So in the early 2010s, there were a few reports that came out really pushing against land dispossession since the mid 2000s, when a couple different actors in the private sector have taken up and responded to pressure that's been put on them about the environmental impacts. And at this point, all of the top global tire companies have declared some kind of environmental sustainability initiative around their rubber supply chains. The waterfall of action kind of came, I think it started with Michelin, which is one of the top tire companies. They've combined and they have created the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. But in parallel, the DFID, which is the UK aid branch, along with a couple civil society organizations, including Mighty Earth, and they've been working with a Chinese industry representative called the Chamber of Commerce for Metal, Mineral, and Chemical Importers. So these are the people in China who are buying latex from the producers in China and beyond. So it's also a bit of a downstream initiative, but they have formed the Sustainable Natural Rubber Guidelines, which are in English and in Chinese, and they've targeted kind of rolling this out, getting Chinese companies that do investment in or grow their own rubber plantations. And there's also a Vietnamese initiative by the Vietnam Rubber Group, which is Vietnam's main state-owned enterprise in the rubber sector. And they've rolled out voluntary guidelines mitigating socio-environmental risks for Vietnamese outward investors in agriculture in the Mekong subregion. So it's a pretty Mekong region, Vietnamese investors specific initiative. And these are really exciting, right? So we have a number of different potentially impactful initiatives coming out of a bunch of different actors. And I think what's especially exciting about these initiatives is that you see action from private sector actors, not only from OECD countries, but from Chinese and Vietnamese companies. All of these initiatives are very, very new. So, you know, the GPSNR, the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, that was kind of brought together by tire companies, but they've had a number of other actors kind of join in, including smallholder representatives. They're just past the phase of kind of defining what sustainability is and how they want to go about it. There are a few steps past that, but same with the Chinese and Vietnamese initiatives. They are in the stage of trying to disseminate their guidelines, but their guidelines are voluntary. Their guidelines are both, you know, they're not linked to specific mechanisms of implementation. It's to be taken up by kind of companies that are interested voluntarily. So there's a lot of questions. And I think another thing to look at when you assess these initiatives is whether it's downstream actors or upstream, because they're all trying to get the producers upstream to change their behavior, but they're all kind of sitting lower downstream. So a lot of questions about how these are going to kind of actually make impact on the ground, but a big change, I would say, in the last 5 years in this sense.
Got it. So we can't hold our breath, but at the same time, this is an exciting new direction that we're seeing emerging. A key point for us is how do we get, as you said, the upstream involved, and particularly the smallholders, plenty of them in the northern landscape, as Hillary pointed out. How do we get them not as just involved in a lucrative industry, but one that can be sustainable for them as well? And here I want to bring up government. So what's been the role of government? How do they see the rubber industry as a potential for Lao, for economic development, for economic and social and sustainable development? Over to Hillary.
Yes, quite early on, as I mentioned, the government was really interested in rubber as a crop for all sorts of social and economic benefits, whether it was opium replacement or new livelihood opportunities for households. So they were quite proactive in promoting rubber as a crop. And, there were study tours to China early on, and invited tours from Vietnamese rubber growers quite early on in the process. So I guess from a geopolitical sense, there was collaboration there very early on. And with that promotion and the rapid acceleration of investment in rubber, as Juliet mentioned, there were some issues. The government's response to these issues was to introduce moratoria on the granting of concession land for rubber. So they did that a couple of times in 2009. So the last moratorium came in 2012, and since then the government has been working to look at the quality of investment in a whole lot of activities, and rubber is one of those. Yes, but the government is certainly still promoting rubber or enabling rubber to households and also through contract farming. And there's activities underway to try and strengthen regulations, particularly around contract farming. Alongside the sustainability initiatives that Juliet mentioned, the government of Laos has made some very strong commitments to things like timber legality. So through the voluntary partnership agreement with the European Union, they're working towards ensuring that all export wood products are verified as legal, and rubber certainly falls in that. And with that, there have been some conundrums, as there are with other smallholder grown crops, in that there are certain regulations that a lot of smallholders don't meet, and some of those are around the legality of the land their trees are planted on and a requirement to register their plantations with government.
For Juliet, you and Hilary, both of you. So what are the key opportunities for Lao in terms of rubber as a sustainable industry, as well as the bottlenecks? What were the challenges?
The challenges, there's different sets of challenges. For the smallholder, and I'll talk about the wood because that's the bit that I have focused on mostly. There are going to be challenges for smallholders to produce legal rubber wood. So there's still a whole raft of regulations that they need to comply with, and they're not complying with them now, partly because they're new to rubber growers. They weren't aware that they needed to register their plantations. And there's a huge legacy of rubber plantations that need to be registered for the wood to be legal. So, 280,000 hectares in total, maybe 140,000 of smallholder or contract farmers. All of those need to be registered if that wood is going to be legally exportable and or comply with the voluntary standards like FSC. And the other for the wood is around raising awareness amongst farmers of the opportunity from their wood, because our research showed that farmers really have a very low awareness of the value of their trees for wood. At the moment, they're cutting it down and using it for firewood. And so they need to be aware of the value of the wood. And secondly, they need to be aware that the wood has to be primary processed or treated very, very quickly. And that means having that infrastructure quite close to the resource areas.
Yeah, so having both Chinese and Vietnamese investment in Laos makes it a great place for both countries' guidelines to be implemented, and for people who study and try to support that kind of initiative. It will also take a long time before these initiatives are kind of running. And I think a little bit of the danger of focusing on a specific crop, as someone who only studies rubber, but studies crop booms also more broadly, is if we focus on just the first domino, just the crop itself, we're going to miss the whole line, and those are just going to keep knocking down other crops that are going to deforest. So we've tried protecting certain spots, and we're trying now protecting forests from certain crops. There has to be a way to connect those dots, and to both intervene in supply chains that are driving rapid change, and to think about the landscape scale solutions, and figuring out how to get smallholders not to invest in lucrative crops. It's ethically a very it's the hot potato, it's a complex thing to intervene in. It's less clear good versus evil than and it's also much harder to wrangle hundreds of smallholders than kind of going up against or trying to change the behavior of one big bad impactful investor. So that the ethics of this are going to be much more complex and less cut and dry than just, getting one big bad plantation company to behave. So like everything, it'll get more and more complex as we go.
Absolutely agree. Okay, thanks both of you. Lots of reason to be optimistic and look forward, but also plenty of challenges ahead. And we can't assume that things are going to change overnight.